Beyond our understanding. The mystery of God's sovereignty. By Nameless Saint. As Christians, we believe in the sovereignty of God. This means that God is in control of all things and has a plan for our lives. However, understanding God's sovereignty can be difficult, especially when we are faced with evil and suffering. In this article, we will explore the concept of God's sovereignty and how it impacts our lives. One famous theologian who wrote extensively about God's sovereignty was John Calvin. He believed that God is in control of everything, including our salvation. In Ephesians chapter 1 verse 11, Paul writes, "In him we have obtained an inheritance, having been predestined according to the purpose of him who works all things according to the counsel of his will." This verse shows that God is in control of all things, including our salvation. So how can we better understand God's sovereignty? Here are 5 points to consider. 1. God is in control of all things. In Isaiah chapter 45 verse 7, God says, "I form light and create darkness. I make well-being and create calamity. I am the Lord, who does all these things." This verse shows that God is in control of everything, both good and bad. While we may not understand why God allows certain things to happen, we must trust that He has a purpose for everything, even time and space. 2. Human free will does not limit God's sovereignty. Some people believe that human free will limits God's sovereignty, but this is not the case. In Romans chapter 9 verse 16, Paul writes, "So then it depends not on human will or exertion, but on God, who has mercy." This verse shows that even though we have free will, our salvation ultimately depends on God's mercy and sovereign will. 3. God's sovereignty does not negate human responsibility. While God is in control of all things, we still have a responsibility to make choices and take actions. In Philippians chapter 2 verses 12 to 13, Paul writes, "Therefore, my beloved, as you have always obeyed, so now, not only as in my presence, but much more in my absence, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling, for it is God who works in you, both to will and to work for his good pleasure." This verse shows that we are responsible for our actions, but it is God who works in us to accomplish his will. 4. Trusting in God's sovereignty brings peace. When we fully trust in God's sovereignty, we can find peace even in difficult circumstances. In Isaiah chapter 26 verse 3, it says, "You keep him in perfect peace whose mind is stayed on you, because he trusts in you." This verse shows that trusting in God brings peace and stability. 5. God's sovereignty over evil and suffering. One of the most difficult aspects of God's sovereignty is that it includes evil and suffering. It can be hard to understand why God allows these things to happen, but we must remember that He has a purpose for everything. In Romans chapter 8 verse 28, Paul writes, "And we know that for those who love God all things work together for good, for those who are called according to His purpose." This verse shows that even in the midst of difficult circumstances, God is working for our good. In addition, we see God's sovereignty over evil and suffering in the story of Joseph in Genesis. His brothers sold him into slavery, but through God's sovereign plan, Joseph became a powerful leader in Egypt and was able to save his family from famine. In Genesis chapter 50 verse 20, Joseph tells his brothers, "As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring it about that many people should be kept alive, as they are today." This verse shows that even when humans meant evil, God was still in control and used it for his good purposes. In conclusion, understanding the sovereignty of God can be difficult, but it is essential for our faith. We must remember that God is in control of all things, and his ways are higher than our ways. We must trust in His sovereign plan and find peace in His control. As we worship Him, we can find comfort in His sovereignty and rest in His love. If you enjoy watching this video, kindly consider subscribing to my channel. New content is posted daily. Thank you, and may God bless you.